we seem all to be pretty united in our moral support of Ukraine here, and so I'm a little bit tempted to start playing the devil's advocate now, and to pour a little bit of water into the wine. But actually I can't, because the Russian claims, of course, that Ukraine is a Nazi country are so ridiculous on the one hand and outrageous on the other, that I can't play the devil's advocate here. I will, however, start with a little bit of a warning, because the fact that we morally support Ukrainians' defensive war against the Russian aggression should not mean that we should kind of start whitewashing Ukrainian history, or start even thinking about it in more positive terms than it is. It's a complicated history. It's in part a history marked by vicious nationalism. It's also a history that has to do with the collaboration of parts of the Ukrainian national movement with the Nazis during the Second World War. So there's no need to whitewash Ukrainian history. It would be misleading. It would kind of put us in a bad spot, and it would not do the Ukraine any favor, of course. In terms of the terminology, Putin's wrong in the first place. Ukraine cannot be denazified, because if anything, the Ukrainian ultranationalists during the Second World War, they were more like part of the fascist world of thinking, but they weren't Nazis, and that's simply the wrong term, which of course works better in the Russian linguistic context than in any other context, but it's the wrong notion, basically demonstrating that on the Russian side they don't care much about the details and the complications of Ukrainian history in the first place. I would say the following: it's no surprise that parts of the national movement were collaborating with the Nazis in the Second World War, because the Soviet authorities drove them there. It's again not very surprising that a country or a nation suppressed in a way as Ukraine was in the 1930s under Stalin, and having experienced Stalinism, or such a brutal version of Stalinism, and having paid such a horrendous price in terms of human losses, that they will turn to any enemy of the Stalinist movement when the opportunity arises. And some of the Ukrainian nationalists were unwise enough to do that, to see Nazism as an opportunity to liberate Ukraine. And of course, that was a historic mistake and put them on the wrong side of history. But it's not surprising from the viewpoint of historical analysis. Whether what the Ukrainians experienced during the 1930s was a genocide or not is something that scholars of genocide debate quite vividly. It's interesting to see that now more scholars tend to call it a genocide after the Russian attack, which is sort of a bit of a political concession, I would say. It of course doesn't change the fact on the ground. It puts it maybe in a longer perspective. But whether we call it genocide or not should not matter too much at this point. It's of course one of the birth hours of the Ukrainian nation in the 20th century. We'll talk about it in a little while, and explains a lot why Ukrainian nationalists would side with the Nazis during the Second World War. They were dreaming of an Ukrainian independent state. They were dreaming of a greater Ukrainian nation state, and they would also dream of an ethnically homogenized and cleansed Ukrainian nation state, which puts them exactly in the same category as each and every other right-wing nationalistic movement in the 1940s, whether it's Romania or Serbia or Croatia or Slovakia. no major difference in terms of concept, and also in terms of practice. It led to participation in acts of genocide. So Ukrainian nationalists killed Jews in great number during the Second World War, and they did that independently or partly independently of what the Germans did, partly in absence of the Germans. So bands of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists hunted Jews because that seemed to be a contribution to ethnic homogeneity of the Ukraine. And there's no way we can deny that. It doesn't matter for today, however. What matters is how does Ukraine deal with its past. And we see very good signs of that. We see very promising research. We see new memorial sites, etc. Another mass crime I would like to briefly mention is massacres of Poles in Volhynia, in Western or Central Ukraine. Again, some scholars call that a genocide of Poles by Ukrainian nationalists. And what we see here is actually a superb and hopeful way the Ukrainian society deals with that. Having reconciled with Poland, having researched the stories, having also looked locally at or researched locally the history of Polish life in those villages that now have been ethnically cleansed. So very promising signs in a time when in Russia organizations like Memorial have been banned, and where studying the crimes of Stalinism has become absolutely impossible. So I see a lot of hope there in Ukraine, that actually Ukraine is entering that, whether we call it a European pathway or not, but a pathway of dealing with the past and facing troublesome parts of their national history. Of course, the 90s were a complicated and not a very pleasant time. That was the time when I spent a bit of time in Western Ukraine, in Lviv. And admittedly, there was a problem with right-wing nationalism. All over the former Soviet orbit, of course. In Russia, just as well, if not more than in Ukraine. Only, of course, the historic framework in Ukraine was a different one. But I haven't visited for a long time, and I can't tell much on the situation on the ground. But from what I read is that far-right activists in Ukraine play less and less and less of a role, unlike in Russia, for that matter. And even the most unpleasant elements of far-right militancy, like the Azov regiment, they took a turn, and the Azov regiment isn't anymore, if it still exists, what it used to be in the early 2000s. So I think finger pointing at Ukraine is not the right thing, especially in countries like Germany, Hungary, Italy, or Russia, for that matter, where the far right is on the rise.
Just a final question, maybe just a comment under 20 seconds or so. Do you think any other leader for Ukraine other than Zelenskyy would be a good choice at the moment? You know, just to gain like wider support for the battle of Ukraine, or is he actually doing a good job, like according to historical perspective?
Yeah. Well, he is doing a good job, a great job, even especially in the light of what I've just been discussing, because he gives Ukraine just so much personal credibility by the way he is, by the way he presents himself, but also by the sheer, in theory, irrelevant fact that he's Jewish, or that he's partly Jewish. But that, of course, gives this Nazi accusations through the mouth of Putin. So he, as a comedian, actually turns that into a comedy or into a farce, and shows what a farce it is, of course. Yeah.